All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Acquire and Operate. Micro SaaS, we're buying and building a portfolio of small niche vertical software businesses, and we're doing it for the love of the game. As you already know, you got Kale here holding it down, hanging with K. Lou. And today we are going to be jamming a lot of acquisition concepts coming at you lately. Obviously, we're in acquisition mode right now, pretty hard pursuing our second acquisition. And so today we're going to be talking about key employee risk, or the headline rather is you must manage key employee risk in micro SaaS acquisitions. So this is, we're talking about today because it's probably top 3 risk of any deal under the sun that's in like the micro SaaS asset class, if you want to call it that. Okay, Lou, firing on all cylinders, bud. I like the button down, sharp as ever.
I had to try something different this time. It's nice out, had to get the sleeves out.
Oh, look at you. You went with the SSBD.
No, I'm feeling good, man. Happy to be here with you today.
Outstanding. All right, so some table of contents for you. What is key employee risk? Figure we'd start there and then answer the question, why is this so common in small bootstrap SaaS firms? And then we'll transition to some common strategies and tactics to mitigate key employee risk. And perhaps we'll jam on some concluding thoughts. So, this is funny, but let's paint a picture. So imagine you step into a business, there's a pretty baked executive team. There's really clear roles that are well defined. There are job descriptions, there are airtight, incentives. You've got total ownership and accountability over marketing, sales, product, engineering, customer success, finance, and everybody knows what to do and everybody's clear and all the procedures are documented. And there's an internal wiki hub that has all the institutional knowledge. So just imagine that. Now imagine totally not that. So now imagine, 2 or 3 people running around like maniacs, trying to do everything, putting out fires. You've got a founder who's probably an engineer, who's writing code. He's responding to customer support tickets at night. He's executing maybe some marketing. Maybe he's jumping on sales calls. The vast majority of the knowledge is between their ears. That's micro SaaS. That's what we're talking about. And obviously that's a very good opportunity to step in and, quote, and I hate to use this term, but professionalize the business, which basically means, really clearly define roles, document procedure, document product, document support, etc. But that's our job, and that's what we do when we transform businesses. But so I think the point is that more often than not, the founder is like the conductor and the entire orchestra, or at least the brass and the string section, and that's something that you got to come into eyes wide. And so the problem or the concern is what happens if this person leaves the business, and probably I guess there's a lot of familiarity with the code base. So that's a big issue. Perhaps they are the face of the business and a lot of the customer relationships are dependent on that. And so there's risk that users will churn, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a big deal, very common in micro SaaS, very common in bootstrap SaaS firms, key employee risk.
Yeah, I would say all of that said another way is the company is the CEO's brainchild, and a lot of that information stays between his ears, in his brain.
Yeah, totally. So if we were to slap a definition on it, so key employee risk is the potential adverse impact on a company's performance, stability, and value due to the departure or loss of a crucial employee who holds significant knowledge, skills, relationships, or responsibilities that are not easily replaceable.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to spin up my screen share here because I think this little bulleted section is good. It articulates some of the points. So at the top of the line, right, and as we noted, and let's just try to encapsulate all of these. So you've got, if we read them top to bottom, so it's like, why is this such a common dynamic in micro SaaS or bootstrap SaaS firms, or just, small business period, honestly. And the headlines are founder-driven operations, limited resources, strong personal relationships, cultural impact, and knowledge concentration. So I think we've kind of beat the founder-driven operations to death. But just assume that the founder is intimately involved in more than one thing. And that when you step in and you're like, okay, and we'll talk, but seller transition is going to be the headline here of how you manage this risk. So you want to be eyes wide on what a day in the life for the founder looks like. So looking at we'll say kind of mitigation risk, but I guess just to close the loop on that thought, it's as simple as, looking at their calendar, Like, how do they spend their time? Ideally, that they're really dialed in time management wise, and they do time boxed activities, etc. But you can probably assume they touch in our context too. They're almost always technical or product oriented. So you probably assume 60 to 70% of their time is spent there, and the remainder is allocated across sales and marketing, and then admin and finance, and just keeping the lights on.
Yeah.
And then obviously, when you have limited resources, you can't hire additional staff and delegate things. So all these activities kind of get concentrated, or the essential tasks get concentrated around a few folks. So limited resources, founder driven operations. And then I think those are common no matter what, full stop, period. Founder driven operations, limited resources. Then things start to get a little bit more nuanced, starting with strong personal relationships. So the thing that I would add here is the more SMB the SaaS, and I guess the higher the volume of users or customers, it's less likely that the founder has super intimate relationships with customers. If this is an enterprise oriented SaaS and we're talking about 20 to 100 customers, that risk goes up significantly, because that means the founder's probably out in the field visiting with key customers. And the same can be said for vendors. So just think key relationships, period. But those can be really underpinned by trust with the founder. And obviously, if the founder departs from the business, those relationships are at risk. But I think that's really context dependent on which category you sell into. And a simple way to distinguish that is, the number of accounts, period. And are these more SMBE and there's a high volume, or are these more mid-market enterprise accounts and they're more concentrated around, 10 to 100 accounts? Anything to add on that stuff thus far, Kev?
Yeah, the other thing I would look at is the vertical as well. You want to look at things if it's more service based and sales led versus if it's more product led. That is also going to determine how much time is being spent.
Absolutely. Well said. And I guess, the headline here are, service-based businesses trade at 1 times revenue at best, probably trade at 1 times margin, but those almost have no value because the key employee risk wipes out all the enterprise value. So if
Yeah.
I'm running Kale's consulting firm and I try to sell it, they're like, well, where'd Kale go? We want to do business with Kale's consulting firm. So it's very hard to transfer ownerships and very hard to think about a business asset that's in the service-based business unless it's productized services and all that stuff's really well defined. And then that trajectory typically looks like bespoke consulting into productized services, into tech-enabled services, into SaaS.
Mm-hmm.
SaaS is
Exactly.
kind of the pinnacle. Okay, so then moving on to cultural impact. So do not sleep on cultural impact. I guess the headline here would be kind of flight risk. So you might assume, and obviously if there's a bigger team, it's like, hey, Kale's leaving. I work here because I love Kale, because Kale's a mentor to me, whatever. So if Kale's leaving, I'm out as well. So there's like a little bit of a contagion, or the likelihood that if that founder leaves, it has repercussions and kind of ripples into the rest of the business. And so you got to be very clear, like, okay, is the lead engineer totally admire the shit out of the founder? And if the founder bounces, I'm going to lose the lead engineer. I didn't think about that. Oh my gosh, I thought the lead engineer's head was in the game. But cultural impact is the headline here. So just think, what happens? What does this business look and feel like if the founder's no longer around? If it's all contractors, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to add that ties back to strong personal relationships, specifically with the users. If it's one of those types of businesses where the founder had spent a lot of time supporting the users, engaging with them in various user communities, strong cultural impact there, because if the messaging is not right with that handover, like there's not a beautiful PR campaign where everyone loves the new guy coming in, you might have a whole cohort of your users just churn because they were so in love with the last founder.
100%. And especially like you can assume that in many cases too, like it's a lot of early adopters that just believe in the founder and what they're doing. They're basically opted into the idea that they're trying to execute on. And that's hard to replace. And
Especially when the founder is one of them, like it's from their community. Say like, I'm in a photographer community. Like, it's tough.
well, I'm a sales leader and I'm doing this sales automation thing and I'm out. It's like, oh boy.
Yeah, you're selling to a suit now.
Yeah, no, not great. And then knowledge concentration, I guess just assume that there's a hardcore lack of documentation across product. Maybe the code base is well done and it's well documented, but there's probably no operating procedures, SOPs, playbooks. There's probably not a ton of kind of embedded repeatability in the business, and all that stuff it's all muscle memory, right? It's all in between
The
the ears.
brainchild's in his brain.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, cool. So now it's like, great, dude. Like, there's tremendous risk. How the hell do we manage it? So the first and most important thing is what's called a seller transition period. So this is basically, and I'll just read the definition, a defined time frame, and we usually anchor it around 3 months, but you want to shoot for 3 to 6 months, during which the seller of a business, typically a key employee such as the founder or CEO, remains actively involved in the company post-acquisition. This period is designed to ensure a smooth and effective transition of responsibilities, knowledge, and relationships to the new owners and management team. The seller transition period often includes specific objectives and milestones to be achieved before the seller's departure. Here are the headlines. So I guess for us, well, like we anchor around a 3-month seller transition period. Obviously, the more key human risk, the longer you probably want that transition period to be. And it's usually on a sliding scale. So month 1 is full time and you're there shadowing, and we'll talk about what your priorities are during month 1. Month 2 is maybe half time. And then month 3 is maybe 10 cumulative hours. But you want to make sure that that's very well defined, that you have a totally thoughtful, documented seller transition period, that's part of the asset purchase agreement or whatever the kind of final documentation is to execute the transaction. The seller transition period is a non-negotiable. It must happen, and it needs to be very, very defined, just like the rest of kind of your, first 100 days, month 1, however you think about it. Seller transition plan is front and center. And so the headlines here are bolstering product and support documentation, establishing documented standard operating procedures, SOPs, how stuff gets done, just step by step, transitioning customer relationships, and then it gets into more of like kind of stabilizing operational processes. And then obviously there's a benefit to an extended transition agreement. So let's start with bolstering product and support documentation. So this is one at varying degrees, but I think you probably want to assume the product is like 60% documented, maybe.
Maybe 40%.
Maybe 40% at best. And this will really depend on the competence from an engineering perspective of the founder. But you want to be all over, like, and that can be, a task, a job. It's like we've identified these gaps in the product documentation. Milestone 1 in month 1 is to round out the product documentation, Mr. and Mrs. Seller founder.
I would put it like this, just as a good rule of thumb. Whatever you're spending or whatever the founder is spending to develop the product, consider half of that needs to get spent for hours going into the documentation. So if you go in and you realize it's not documented, as part of that seller transition, you want to identify what is it going to cost to get everyone in place, all of the engineers, if it's outsourced contractors, you want to identify what does that cost look like to now get this all documented, because that in itself lives on a product roadmap. That is part of a product roadmap itself.
Totally. And I guess one thing too that's interesting is that if you plan on bringing in your own engineering team, the product documentation is a very good ramp exercise. It's basically like go into the house and write where everything is and how it works. And then we can start building the new bedroom.
And if you have questions, validate with the previous founder, if you're lucky, a previous engineer, that this all works the way we think it works, because that validation is important too.
Beautiful. And then I guess bonus points for, if you can run some analysis on the support tickets. ChatGPT is your best friend. Large language models are your best friend. And it's like, okay, it looks like these are the 30 most common FAQs. Great. Now giddy up on documenting responses to those FAQs, because the content will scale and that'll speed you up a lot on support interactions.
And code analysis, we talk about code documentation. It will tell you not only how to create a skeleton around documenting your code, it can also tell you where there's gaps in your code to improve it. So that can be part of your own due diligence process to now sit with the seller, identify how do we improve this LOI.
Totally. And then, so I guess transitioning now to establishing documented standard operating procedures. Vidyard and Loom are your best friend, because you want to Scribe how is totally, they do step-by-step kind of click screenshot grabs. So you want this to be, and you want to reduce the burden on the human. So it's like, hey, just do what you do. Just do me a favor and hit screen record before you do it. And then, because that's as real as it gets, right? And then just be like, hey, if you wouldn't mind thinking out loud as you work through whatever this process is, objective number 1 is screen recording every single thing ever. But obviously power law applies here. So you want to go after the 20% of procedures that impact 80% of the business, and don't kill yourself via, death by documentation. So highly recommend screen recording. And then once you have the screen recording, you have a transcript, you can drop that into an LLM and have it spit out a step-by-step guide. And then bonus points for and then obviously this is only as useful as it is accessible. Well, let me drop some rhymes on you. So, anchor all these SOPs in a table in Notion. This is the central repository for how we operate this business, and away you go. Transitioning customer relationships. So this one, everybody needs to put their PR hat on, because I guess what's the tendency? A new stranger buys the business and is introduced to the CEO. What are you thinking as a user?
As a user, I'm like, is he going to raise prices? First of all, who is this guy? Does he even understand the business? If I reach out for support, will he even understand what I need? There's a lot of questions here. Will I get a chance to speak with them? Like, how long will the business be around?
Yeah,
How many more times will it be sold? It's just now it's existential for me.
yeah. Or it's like, is this human going to gut the business? Are they going to cut costs and jack prices? And am I just going to get totally screwed? So you
Is this
have,
going to be an MSNBC moment when I
yeah,
put on the news tomorrow?
or you have to think that like you are addressing a PR concern, right?
Yes,
Like the users are alarmed. That's kind of the base case emotional state across the user base. So you want to be super thoughtful about that communication plan. Introduce yourself as the new seller. I'm the new operator, CEO, the new owner. Disclose your plan. Because the truth, just tell like Twain said, right? If you're telling the truth, you don't have to remember anything. So it's like,
exactly.
hey, we're here to make this more valuable. We're here to improve support. We're here to execute on a dope roadmap. We're here to grow the business. We're here to make it better, period. That's what we do. That's the only way we can generate a return. Like, we're here to make this thing awesome. Here's how we're going to do it. Here's our game plan. Here's how you can get in touch with us. You might even, if you're feeling courageous, do an AMA, ask me anything. But you want to be super thoughtful about how you communicate to customers. Don't assume that they're like, oh yeah, they won't care. They care, especially if the software is kind of critical to their business operation. So you want to be as thoughtful and human and personal as you possibly can, in kind of transitioning yourself in as CEO, operator, and your team. So that's kind of the most macro. At a more micro level, you probably, and again, this back to context, but if it's an enterprise scenario and you've got 30 key accounts, you probably want to get your ass on the road and go visit with these customers in person. Yo, I'm here. I'm a human. This is what I smell like. Shake my hand. Let's break bread. Whatever the case may be, because you want to make sure that you react to that. And you're basically just assure. It's assure. You're in good hands. We're going to love the hell out of this business. We're only going to make it better. Don't go anywhere. And then also that's an extraordinary opportunity to familiarize yourself with the market. What
Hmm.
pain points do you have? What are we missing? An NPS survey out of the gate is super productive. It's like, yo, what do you love the most? If we took away one thing, what would it be that would, like, if there's one thing that went away, what would be absolutely the most devastating? Okay, cool. If you had a magic wand, what's the one thing you were missing? Keep it simple. But those surveys are a really, really good way to start engaging users and kind of set a tone. Okay. Next is stabilizing operational processes. And that's like, just find the stuff that is really broken that the founder probably has a unique point of view on, and you want to solve for that immediately. So that's that seller transition period where it's like, we want to plug holes in the ship so that it stops sinking in this way. And you want to make sure that you utilize the seller's domain expertise, their institutional knowledge, tribal knowledge, whatever you want to call it, to get that stuff solved for. Because when they leave after that seller transition period, and I guess as soon as the transaction happens, you can expect their engagement to fall off a cliff. As soon as
Hmm.
that seller transition period is done, and the majority, again, back to our assumptions, is that these founders are pretty damn burnt out, right? They've been grinding on a business for 4 or 5 years. It's their baby. They've gotten it to a place that can't really get it further. So
Yep.
just, again, these all need to back into your assumptions.
I
And
would
then,
say to add to that, honorable mentions going back to the Pareto principle. Look at the 20% of business critical issues that will cause the business to fail, and then lean into your RICE framework to now start to force rank what you want to address first, and away you go.
yeah, so and I think the headline here is you want to get as much knowledge out of their brain as humanly possible via SOPs and documentation.
Right.
Period. That's it. That's the objective of the seller transition period. Okay, so now other macro tactics. Just two here, but I'm a huge advocate of including the seller in the new business entity via small slug of equity. So
Yeah,
it's
we don't gut businesses here.
and it's like, yo, why don't you come over? Like, we're gonna buy the assets from you. We have a new holding company. Why don't you take 5% in exchange for 10 hours of board advisory, whatever, per month? And I guess the bright side, the best case of this scenario is that the founder gets to, quote unquote, take another bite out of the apple. So ideally, you're
Hmm.
going to execute a thing that creates enterprise value. they get another bite out of the apple because you bring a complementary skill set. Everybody, and I guess that's their win. Your win is you don't lose access to that institutional tribal knowledge that's so hyper valuable. And at the end of the day, it's kind of an insurance policy. They know where the bodies are buried. So if something lights on fire, it's like, oh God, I really wish I had the founder's ear. I really wish that they could just help me get to where this thing is, whatever it is. So huge advocates of, and this is called rolling equity. And there, there's some different ways to execute that. Maybe you just take the equity or take that chunk of equity in the new entity off the purchase price. Maybe you keep the purchase price, whatever it is, and then just give them some sweet equity at no fee. You can ask them to invest to take that equity position so that they have some skin in the game. They have some downside. That's always good. You want to align incentives both to the upside and the downside. And we usually anchor around 3 to 5%. And you want the commitment to be defined. It's not like, hey, why don't you come on as an equity partner and, you can ride the ride. It's like you come on as an equity partner and you're accountable to 10 hours of engagement a quarter, whatever it is, but really clearly define that. And then lastly is, I guess this plays on the theme of like flight risk. So if you're like, oh man, I think that this one engineer is absolutely enamored with the founder, and if the founder bounces, we might lose this engineer. Play with it, retention bonuses, play with milestone-based bonuses, play with stuff. But there's a lot of different mechanics available to you to incentivize those employees to stick around, those contractors to stick around to achieve milestones and prevent that kind of what did I say? The contagion, right? Where if one person leaves, oh man, all of a sudden everybody bounces because they were there because of that one human. So retention bonuses and other stuff like that are your best friend. Concluding thoughts. Do not sleep on the employee risk. This is very real in micro SaaS, and a seller transition period should be a huge part of your thought process when you go to closing, when when you're grinding through LOIs. They got to be there. It's part of the game we play. A really, really well-defined seller transition period will totally improve your chances of success, because the first order of business is to not destabilize the business. It's like you don't want to come in and just totally derail everything that was going on that was productive. You want to keep things stable and steady Eddie, and then observe, document, build conviction around whatever your assumptions were for the thesis. Take as much advantage as humanly possible of having the founder around. And then once that seller transition period is over, it starts to get very real. And that's something also to mention too, like that is a Band-Aid moment that is gnarly. Because it's like your parents are like, okay, I'm leaving. Then you can't call me. And it's like, what if I get hungry? And I don't even know where all this stuff is. And it's like, dude, just bite the bullet and go. But make sure you're productive during that seller transition period, and just make sure that it's there.
Yeah.
Gucci
gang, I would say trust that you've done everything up until this moment and you are prepared to just rip the Band-Aid off. And honestly, there are going to be some things that you might not have thought of, but that's the name of the game. So lean in.
And ripping that Band-Aid is a great moment of truth. It's good for you. Get you out of your comfort zone. So look forward to that moment. It's like, all right, but now you kind of assume that that's like a little bit of a training wheel period too. So like the distinction between that seller transition period versus when you're all alone operating is night and day. So lean into it, let her rip. That discomfort is where you grow. That's what it's all about. All right, y'all. For the love of the game, laser beams on the way out. All right, K-Lou, pleasure as always, my GL. See you around.
Until next time.
Peace.